Snow lay thin and bright over Lochtub, the kind that made every sound travel, and every secret feel louder than it should. New Year's morning arrived clean and sharp, and with it the village's old habit of first footing, the belief that the first person to cross a threshold after midnight decided the luck of the year. Coal for warmth, whiskey for cheer, bread for hunger. That was how it was meant to be. That was how it had always been, until the first-foot guest, Morag Mac Leod's croft, never left. Morag was found just after dawn by her nearest neighbour, old Willie Ross, who had come to check on her after noticing her lamp still burning. The croft door was shut fast, the bolt thrown from the inside. Willie rapped and called her name, then called again, and when there was no answer, he fetched the constable. They forced the door, breaking the frame, and found Morag seated at her small kitchen table, her head slumped forward as if she had nodded off mid-thought. A half-filled glass of whisky stood untouched by her right hand. There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned chairs, no broken crockery, no blood. He was dead all the same. He, doctor, would later say it was poison swift, clean, tasteless, but at the time all anyone could say was that Morag looked almost peaceful, her lips faintly blue in the cold light. What made the scene uncanny was not the body, but the carefulness of everything else. The windows were latched from within. The hearth was warm, a single piece of coal still glowing red. On the table lay a small linen bundle tied with twine, exactly the sort of thing a first-footer would bring. Inside it were a heel of bread, a flask that smelled of good malt, and a lump of coal black as night. Yet Morag had been alone when she went to bed, or so she had told half the village the night before. She had waved off visitors early, claiming a headache and a desire for a quiet turning of the year. No one was supposed to cross her threshold after midnight. No one except, perhaps, the unseen guest who had done so anyway. The constable took stock with growing unease. There were footprints on the snow outside the croft, only one set, approaching from the road and stopping at the door. They did not lead away again. It was as if the visitor had arrived and vanished. Inside, on the flagstone floor by the hearth, there were damp marks where boots had stood to warm, faintly smudged with coal dust. They pointed inward, toward the table, and nowhere else. The bolt on the door was stout and simple, the kind that could not be reached from outside. The key lay on its hook. No chimney was wide enough for a person. No hidden passage existed in a croft that small. More troubling still was the coal. It was not Morag's. She burned peat, like most of Lochtub, and kept no coal of her own. The piece in the hearth matched the one in the linen bundle. Hard and glossy, city coal. Someone had brought it deliberately, honouring the old custom even as they broke it. Someone who knew the ritual well enough to follow it to the letter. The whiskey, when tested later, would be found harmless. The bread was ordinary. The poison had been delivered another way, and there was nothing on the table to suggest how. Morag's cup bore no residue. Her food was untouched. Even the air smelled only of peat smoke and clean frost. By mid-morning the village had gathered, voices hushed, faces tight with the discomfort of a tradition turned sour. Some swore Morag had no enemies. Others remembered old slights, sharp words at the shop, an argument years back that had never been fully forgiven. Each explanation felt too thin, too human, for a crime that had left no door open and no path back out. When word reached Hamish Macbeth, he stood for a long moment looking out over the loch, the pale winter sun glinting on ice. A locked door. A proper first-foot gift. Footprints that came but did not go. It was the sort of puzzle that pretended to be simple, dressed up in village superstition, while hiding something colder beneath. He pulled on his coat, already certain that whatever had crossed Morag Mac Leod's threshold had not come to bring luck, and that the real misfortune was only beginning to show itself. Hamish Macbeth arrived at Morag Mac Leod's croft, while the constable was still answering the same questions from the same villagers, his notebook filling with half-memories and polite guesses. Hamish listened without interrupting, his gaze drifting instead to the door-frame, splintered where it had been forced. The break was fresh, the wood pale beneath, and he noted how the bolt had been drawn with care, not slammed in haste. Whoever had last touched it had taken their time. Inside, the air held a faint sweetness beneath the smoke, something the others seemed to miss entirely. Hamish paused just inside the threshold, looking down. The footprints on the floor were pointed out to him at once proof, the constable said, that someone had stood by the hearth. Hamish nodded, but his eyes lingered on the spacing. The boots had been set close together, toes angled slightly inward, as if the wearer had been uncomfortable, shifting their weight. Not a relaxed stance, not the posture of a welcome guest. He crossed to the table, without sitting, bending to Morag's level. Her hands were clean, nails short, no sign she had handled coal recently. The linen bundle lay neatly folded, the twine tied with a sailor's knot. Hamish untied it and retied it twice, frowning. It was competent, confident. Not the sort of knot a man tied only once a year out of tradition. He asked the constable who in Lockdown had gone to see a few, the man said, but none of them were near Morag last night. Hamish only hummed, his attention caught by the whisky glass. He lifted it, sniffed, then held it to the light. The rim was clean, too clean. If Morag had poured a dram for a guest, there should have been a mark, a smear, something to suck. Just a mouth had touched it. This glass had been poured and left. Like a prop in a story someone wanted told. At the hearth he crouched, close enough to feel the warmth on his face. The coal was real enough, but beneath it lay peat ash, undisturbed except where the coal had been set down, carefully, gently, as if the fire itself were part of the performance. Hamish reached into his pocket and drew out a match, struck it, and let it burn down. The smoke curled oddly before drifting upward. He sniffed again, more deliberately this time, and caught it a faint, bitter tang that did not belong to peat or coal at all. Doctor say anything yet? Hamish asked. Poison. The constable replied. Quick acting. No burns, no marks. Ah, Hamish said softly, still crouched, but no sign she drank it. He stood and turned to the villagers clustered by the door. Their faces were drawn, eyes bright with fear and curiosity. One woman clutched her shawl tight, shaking her head as if to ward off bad luck. Another crossed herself. Hamish watched them, not for what they said, but for how they watched him. Most looked at Morag. One man, Callum Fraser, kept glancing at the hearth. Hamish spoke to him gently. You warm yourself there often, Callum? Callum startled. Me? No, I mean I, sometimes, but not last night. I was at home, with your wife. Hamish asked. Callum hesitated just long enough to notice. Aye, she'll tell you. Hamish let it go for now. He moved to the door and stepped outside. He cold, biting at his face. The single set of footprints led from the road straight to the threshold. He followed them slowly, noting their depth, the drag at the heel. Whoever had made them had been carrying something heavy held close to the body. Not a linen bundle that weighed next to nothing. Something else, brought in and taken out again, though the snow claimed otherwise. He crouched near the doorpost and brushed away loose snow with his glove. There, half hidden, was a smear of dark powder ground into the wood. Not coal dust this time, but something finer. Hamish touched it, then brought his fingers to his nose. Bitter. Sharp. Inside, the constable was already talking about suspects, about who might have quarrelled with Morag. Hamish barely listened. His mind was fixed on the care of it all, the clean glass, the perfect gift, the staged footprints. Someone had wanted this to look like a mystery born of superstition, something the village could whisper about for years. But beneath the folklore was intention. And beneath the intention, fear. He looked once more at Morag's still face, and felt the first solid shape of the truth forming, incomplete but unmistakable. This had not been a crime of opportunity, nor of passion. It had been rehearsed, and whoever had crossed the threshold had counted on everyone else seeing exactly what they were meant to see. Hamish Macbeth stayed at the croft long enough for the constable to finish his list, then suggested mildly, as if it were an afterthought, that they speak to a few people while the details were still fresh. The village was already humming with speculation, doors opening and closing as neighbours leaned in to share what they knew. Hamish preferred to hear what they would say when they thought it mattered. They began with Willie Ross, who had found Morag that morning. Willie sat stiffly at his own kitchen table, hands folded around a mug of tea he did not drink. He told the story again, just as he had before, the light still on, the door bolt, the uneasy feeling that made him fetch help instead of going inside himself. You did try the door at all? Hamish asked. Willie shook his head quickly. No. Did seem right. Forcing my way in, not on New Year's morning. Hamish nodded, though he noticed how Willie's eyes flicked to the window when he spoke. Outside, the road was visible, the place where the single set of footprints had begun. Willie said nothing more, and nothing he said was untrue. It was what he left unsaid that lingered. Next came Callum Fraser, who received her with a show of openness that felt almost rehearsed. He ushered them into his sitting room, offered chairs, tea, biscuits. His wife sat beside the fire, silent, her gaze fixed on the flames. You were at home all night? Hamish asked. Aye, Callum said readily. Did step outside once after midnight. Too cold. And you did see anyone passing along the road? Callum smiled, a little too quickly. Hard to see much in the dark. His wife's hands tightened in her lap. Hamish turned to her. "And you, Mrs. Fraser?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Callum was with me all night." The pause was small, but it was there. Hamish thanked them and left without pressing further, though he caught the faintest look of relief on Callum's face. When the door closed behind them, they spoke to others Morag's distant cousin, who had argued with her over land years ago, but had been away in Inverness, the shopkeeper, who insisted Morag had seemed perfectly well the evening before, a fisherman who swore he had heard footsteps near the croft after midnight, but could not say whose. Each account fit neatly on its own, and none of them matched quite as well as they should have set together. By the time they reached the post office, Hamish's head was full of half-truths. The postmistress, a sharp-eyed woman with the habit of noticing what others missed, leaned across the counter as he spoke to her. "Funny thing," she said. "Callum was in here late afternoon yesterday. Bought a packet of matches. Said he'd run out." Hamish thanked her, though his thoughts were already turning. Matches were common enough, but he remembered the bitter smell near the hearth, the way the smoke had curled last there. Spoke to Morag's nearest neighbour, a woman named Eyelid Kerr, who lived just far enough away not to hear every sound. She stood at her doorway, arms folded tight. "I didn't see anyone go in," she said, before Hamish had even asked. "And I didn't see anyone leave." "But you were awake?" Hamish asked. "Aye, I could sleep." "Did you hear anything at all?" Eyelid hesitated. "There was a smell. Late on. Not smoke. Something sharp. I thought maybe someone was burning rubbish." Hamish felt the pieces shift slightly. "You did mention that earlier." She looked down. Did tea seem important? Back at the croft, the constable was growing frustrated. "None of it. Solid," he said. "Everyone's got an answer." "That's the trouble," Hamish replied. "They've all got the right ones." He stood in the doorway again, listening to the quiet of the place. The crime was wrapped in village manners, in customs and courtesy, but beneath it ran a current of calculation. Someone had brought poison close enough to kill, had staged a ritual, had trusted that everyone would look at the superstition and not the person behind it. As Hamish stepped back into the cold, he knew the voices he heard were not lies so much as careful arrangements of truth. And somewhere among them was the one voice that mattered most, shaping the story from the start and counting on the others to carry it for them. Hamish returned to the croft as the sun climbed higher, brushing frost from the heather outside. Inside, the quiet felt heavier now, thick with questions that refused to settle. He sat on the edge of Morag's kitchen chair, eyes tracing the familiar contours of the room, the table, the bundle, the hearth, while his mind turned over the story he had heard. Each voice had its own spin, each alibi plausible enough on the surface, yet something about the timing, the omissions, the subtle eagerness or hesitation of those he spoken with refused to align neatly. Greed was the first thread he pulled. Morag had been a small woman with a careful life, yet she possessed property others coveted. Her cottage, the croft land behind it, the small savings tucked away in a drawer. Cousins, neighbours, even some of the villagers might have seen a windfall in her passing, but greed alone did. To explain the care of the crime the gift left untouched, the single footprint, the staged first-foot ceremony. Someone who merely wanted her gone would have been clumsy, leaving traces of haste or panic. Whoever had done this had patience and knowledge of the old ways. Revenge flickered into consideration next. Years ago, Morag had refused to sell her land to a man who had grown impatient and hot-tempered in the village. There had been arguments, voices raised over small matters, grudges that sometimes simmered beneath polite conversation. But when Hamish thought about it, the timing did not fit. A sudden act of fury would have left chaos, not the meticulous arrangement he had seen. The pattern of care suggested planning, not rage. Jealousy, too, left a mark. Morag had never married, yet she had acquaintances, even friends, whom others might envy either for her independence or for the small influence she held in the village. Hamish imagined air-whispered conversations. She has what we don't. She lives as she pleases. But envy rarely leaves such careful, almost ceremonial, traces. It was subtle, yes, but it did not explain the hidden danger in the smoke, the faint bitter tang, or the deliberate confusion of footprints. Fear, however, whispered louder than any of the others. Someone had approached Morag with knowledge, with intent. They had considered what she knew, what she might reveal, and had acted to prevent it. Hamish's thoughts drifted to the careful footprints, the coal, the linen bundle, the poison delivered without contact. Fear motivated secrecy, deception, calculation. It made sense that the killer had relied on the village's own tradition to disguise their crime. Hamish began mapping connections in his mind. Callum Fraser's eager cooperation, his purchase of matches, the slight tremor in his story, and the glance of relief when questions turned elsewhere, small but persistent signs that he had something to hide. Then there was the cousin, distant but persistent in her grievances, though no evidence placed her anywhere near the croft, and the fisherman's vague testimony about footsteps he could not identify, which had come to nothing, yet now seemed worth a second glance. Each thread was tangled with the others. Greed could feed jealousy. Revenge could hide behind fear. The village itself became a web of subtle pressures, alliances and rivalries, old arguments that had been buried but not forgotten, minor embarrassments that could grow into lasting resentment. Hamish felt the weight of it, the intricate lattice of human motive that had shaped a crime so clever in its disguise that the very simplicity of first-foot superstition had become its shield. He returned to Morag's table, touching the linen bundle lightly. The gift had been left carefully, presented almost lovingly, as if to mislead the observer into thinking the visitor was welcome, friendly, even benign. Someone had planned it all, counting on human assumption to mask their intent. Hamish thought of each suspect, each story, each half-truth, and realized that, while any of them could have a reason to harm her, none of the obvious motive aligned fully with the meticulous way the crime had been executed. In the silence of the croft, Hamish's mind began to shift from the surface to the unseen. The evidence was not in the arguments, or the grudges, or the whispered fears, but in the connections between them, the subtle inconsistencies, the relief in some faces, the calculated appearances of others. If he could trace those connections, follow the motives along their true lines rather than their obvious ones, he might begin to unravel the carefully woven illusion. And somewhere in that maze of fear, envy, and greed, he knew, was the hand that had crossed Morag Mac Leod's threshold and brought death along with it. Why the late afternoon? The constable returned from Inverness with news that seemed to promise resolution. Package had been found at the edge of the village, discarded hastily among the snowdrifts, addressed in a familiar hand. Inside were several small vials, one of them still half full of a liquid that matched the poison in Morag's system. There was also a note, written in trembling ink, confessing to the deed, and naming Callum Fraser as the culprit. The villagers buzzed with excitement at the news, voices spilling into the streets. It's solved. Justice is done. Hamish heard their murmurings, felt the weight of relief settle over Lochderb like a comforting blanket. But the feeling did not reach him. The constable, flushed with pride, could hardly contain himself. "Well, that's it then, Hamish. Easy enough. The evidence is clear, the confession is clear, and Callum's name is right there. We can close it." Hamish studied him for a long moment, his brow furrowed. He said nothing at first, letting the constable bask in triumph. Then, finally, he spoke, quietly, deliberately. "Aye, it looks neat, don't it? Too neat, perhaps." He returned to Morag's croft as the light waned, moving slowly past the table, past the untouched whisky, past the neat bundle of coal and bread. His eyes traced the path the visitor had taken, from the door to the hearth, noting again the careful placement of each object, the way nothing had been disturbed beyond what was absolutely necessary. Hamish's hands hovered over the linen bundle. The confession in Inverness, the note and the vials, they all fit too conveniently. They presented a tidy narrative that wrapped up the village's fears, but only if one chose to accept it at face value. He crouched by the hearth and examined the smear in the wood, the faint bitter trace of something finer than coal dust. The smell was subtle but persistent. He had thought about it all day, traced it with his fingers, and it stubbornly refused to match the pattern of Callum's simple purchase of matches, or the vials supposedly discarded. It was a clue that belonged to someone else entirely, someone who had orchestrated the crime with care and precision, leaving the confession as a decoy. The villagers' joy outside the croft was deafening now, the chatter and laughter echoing down the narrow street. Hamish stepped to the window and watched Callum's house. The man was inside, pacing, a hand pressed against his forehead, nervous but outwardly calm. Too calm. Hamish sensed the act, the performance, the way Callum allowed the village to believe in his guilt without confirming it. The real puppeteer remained hidden, letting others bear the weight of suspicion. Returning to the table, Hamish examined the vials the constable had shown him earlier. Their labels were crude, written in a hand meant to appear uncertain. The liquid inside matched the poison, yes, but something about the sediment, the slight coating of dust, felt rehearsed. Someone had prepared them not to kill, but to mislead. The confession, the vials, the carefully dropped package, it was an illusion, a false victory staged for the authorities and the villagers alike. Hamish walked slowly around the room, listening to the quiet. The footsteps that had come and gone, the coal that had been laid with ceremonial care, the untouched food and drink, every detail was a message, every object a signal to anyone attentive enough to read it. And he had read it. The killer had counted on the simplicity of superstition, on the assumptions of the frightened and the credulous, to divert attention. They had relied on the community's relief, on the quickness with which a confession could settle uneasy hearts. The evening deepened, and the shadows grew long across the croft. Hamish lit a small lamp, letting the glow fall over the table and hearth. He studied Morag's face once more, calm in death, and thought of the meticulous nature of the crime. Someone had prepared for every contingency, planned every angle, and left others to take the blame. A false victory, yes, but one that could not last. He leaned against the doorframe, staring to the village outside. The real criminal was out there, still walking among them, still watching. They were patient, calculating, confident that the case had been closed. Hamish felt the thrill of the chase tighten in his chest, a quiet certainty that this was far from over. The shadows were long, the village celebrating a victory that was not theirs, and somewhere within it, the true hand behind Morag MacLeod. Death waited for the right moment to strike again, or perhaps to leave. A final message, one only the keenest observer could decipher. Hamish spent the next morning retracing the movements of those who had crossed Morag's threshold, his boots crunching over frost and scattered leaves. The village was quieter now, the false relief still lingering but thinner, more fragile than the authorities. Official declarations suggested. As he walked past the croft, his eyes caught on the small ledger that had been left on the windowsill. Morag's record of neighbours and visitors, little entries scribbled in a careful hand. He picked it up, flipping through pages that recorded nothing remarkable, nothing of consequence, until he reached the edge of the ledger, a faded entry nearly smudged beyond recognition. It was a name he hadn't expected. Duncan Fraser, not Callum, but his older brother, long gone from Lockdub, a man who had disappeared 20 years ago in circumstances whispered about but never confirmed. The entry noted a borrowed tool, a small payment made, and a cryptic phrase, debt unpaid. Hamish's mind immediately raced. A family quarrel, old debts, forgotten grudges, things the village had long since assumed settled. But the ledger suggested otherwise, a link between past and present. That could not be ignored. He recalled the voices from yesterday, the slight hesitation in Callum Fraser's story, the relief that passed over his face when questions turned elsewhere. And then there was the cousin, persistent yet distant, her interest. In Morag's land, always polite on the surface, but pointed beneath. The connections between them had been there all along, subtle but enduring, woven into the fabric of Lockdub like hidden threads in an old tartan. Hamish realized that the crime had roots not just in envy or greed, but in a web, spun decades earlier. The kind of grievance that time never erased, it only lay dormant, waiting for an opportunity. Back at the croft, he examined the hearth once more, tracing the lines of coal dust and faint smudges on the floor. It struck him that the arrangement of footprints, the precise positioning of objects, and the carefully staged first-foot ceremony were all methods of control, of sending a message, not just to the authorities or the village, but to someone else. Someone who understood the history behind the ledger. Someone who would recognize the meaning of a particular knot in the twine, a specific placement of coal. Hamish's eyes narrowed. This was not random superstition. It was a cipher, a coded echo of old debts and old conflicts. He visited the postmistress again, seeking details of the package that had created the false victory. The handwriting was hesitant, familiar enough to anyone who had handled letters in Lockdub for decades. She confirmed that it had arrived at an odd hour, postmarked from Inverness, but the style of penmanship suggested it had been guided by someone who had once lived in the village. Hamish's mind drew the map between ledger entries, lingering grudges, and current suspicion. The vials, the confession, even the careful staging all were designed to mislead, but they carried the faint signature of someone intimately familiar with the history of these families. Someone who knew that old wounds could be leveraged, twisted into something deadly. He walked the streets slowly, noting the cottages of the Frasers and Morag's distant relatives, the patterns of ownership, the old arguments over land, and a long-forgotten lawsuit that had been dismissed as trivial all began to form a lattice in his thoughts. Suddenly, the ledger's faint notation made sense. Someone had returned to collect what they considered owed. The timing New Year, the ritual of first footing was symbolic. The message had to be delivered in plain sight, yet remain hidden in interpretation. Only someone who knew both the history and the village's traditions could orchestrate such a precise act, Hamish felt the chill of recognition. This was why the false confession had been so readily accepted. It was easier to blame a living, nearby person than to trace the crime back to a shadow from the past. Someone had counted on the authorities' assumptions, on the comfort of a tidy solution, and yet the past was stubborn. Its echoes were etched into ledgers, memories, and cautious gestures, waiting for the patient observer to see the connections no one else had noticed. Returning to the craft, Hamish sat by the table, turning the ledger carefully in his hands. The pieces of the puzzle were no longer scattered, they were aligning, threads of history weaving into the present, revealing a pattern of vengeance and calculation that spanned decades. Morag's death was not merely about her wealth, or a fleeting grudge, it was the culmination of old debts, old alliances, and old resentments, and as he traced each line with his finger, Hamish realized that the true architect of the crime had planned it with knowledge and patience, leaving the village to celebrate a resolution that was only an illusion, a shadow cast by the past. Hamish returned to the croft that evening, carrying with him a small vial of harmless dye he had prepared earlier. It was the kind of trick he rarely used, the kind that relied on human instinct more than evidence. Subtle pressure, applied in the right way, could reveal hesitation, guilt, or overconfidence. He did not announce his purpose, only invited Callum Fraser to accompany him for a final check at the scene, under the pretense of ensuring nothing else had been disturbed. Callum arrived briskly, expression polite but measured. He stepped inside, eyes darting to the hearth, the table, the footprints on the floor. Hamish observed him without comment, letting the silence stretch, forcing the younger man to fill it. They walked slowly to the table, Hamish tracing the bundle of coal and bread with his finger, lightly dusting a trace of the dye on the edge of the table where a hand might naturally brush. Just helping me see what might have been missed, Hamish said casually. The first foot gift, it's tricky, isn't it? Easy to overlook a detail in the ritual. His voice carried no accusation, only observation, but the suggestion lingered in the air. Callum leaned closer to inspect the coal, lifting it to look at the underside. Hamish's eyes followed every movement. The dye remained invisible to the casual observer, but he noted the tension in Callum's fingers, the slight tremor when he set the coal back down. He smiled faintly, masking it behind a hand as though reflexively. Curious, Hamish murmured, it's strange how some people handle these old customs. Some are careful, others not so much. It tells a lot about how a person thinks, doesn't it? Callum laughed softly, too quickly, and moved toward the window, pretending to inspect the frost outside. But his eyes flicked repeatedly toward the hearth, the bundle, the table. Hamish let the gaze pass without comment, merely watching the subtle tightening of Callum's jaw. Funny, isn't it? Hamish continued, how a person can be clever enough to stage something perfectly, and yet small habits, they always give something away. He knelt and brushed the dye across the tabletop near the edge of the linen bundle, then stepped back. Nothing to worry about. It's invisible, harmless. I just like to see what people touch naturally. Habit tells stories. Callum froze for a heartbeat longer than necessary before continuing his examination of the room. He adjusted the fire, stirred the coals slightly, and even lifted the bundle again. When he set it down, Hamish caught the faintest hint of the dye on the corner of his glove. Almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm instinct. Callum had handled the object in a way inconsistent with an innocent visitor, you see, Hamish said softly, not looking at him directly. Most people wouldn't even notice the way they interact with things. But it's all recorded, in habit, in gesture. Even a practiced story can't override it. He allowed the silence to stretch, letting the weight of observation settle around Callum for a moment. The younger man's composure faltered. His eyes darted toward Hamish, quick, searching for some sign of accusation. Yet he said nothing. Hamish observed a tiny shift, a hand brushing the edge of a glove against the other hand, a flicker of tension at the corner of his mouth, a blink just a little too long. The clues were invisible to anyone else, but unmistakable to Hamish. Nothing obvious, Hamish added, rising and stepping back. Just curious habits. Sometimes they reveal more than words ever could. Callum nodded too quickly, and smiled, forcing the edges of his mouth upward. I, curious, always have been. Learned a lot from you, Hamish, watching how you notice things. But Hamish, eyes lingered on him, quietly triumphant. The smallest crack in Callum's carefully constructed composure had appeared. It was subtle, almost laughable to an outsider, but to Hamish It was a key turning point, a gesture, a touch, a reaction small, human, impossible to fake entirely. The truth, he realized, often revealed itself not in the story people told, but in the unguarded moments they forgot to hide. And Callum Fraser had just given him one. Hamish awoke the next morning to a biting wind that swept across Loch Derb, carrying with it the scent of frost and peat smoke. He dressed quickly and headed for Morag's Croft, determined to examine the bundle of evidence he had secured the day before, certain it would clarify the subtle hints he had noticed in Callum's behaviour. The linen bundle, the caul, the faint traces of dye, they were all small, fragile pieces of a larger puzzle, and Hamish knew they had to be protected. But when he arrived, his heart sank. The door, which he had carefully bolted the night before, hung ajar. The croft was silent in a way that made the bones of the building creak. Inside, everything seemed in place at first glance. The table, the hearth, the floorboards, but the linen bundle was gone. Hamish froze, scanning the room. No footprints beyond his own. No signs of forced entry other than the slight shift of the door. It was as if someone had moved through the room without disturbing a single thing. The vials and notes from Inverness were untouched. Ched, still sitting on the edge of the table, but the centrepiece, the bundle that had tied the physical evidence to the psychological trick, was gone. Hamish's mind raced. Whoever had taken it knew its significance. Whoever had staged the false confession and delivered the vials had left that package as a trail. But now the real proof had vanished. He crouched near the hearth, inspecting the caul and the faint smudges of dye. They were untouched, yet the absence of the bundle left a hollow certainty in his chest. Someone was actively working to bury the truth before he could confirm it. His gaze swept the windows, the doorframe, even the faint marks of footprints outside. Nothing. The thief had been careful, precise, familiar with the croft, and with the habits of anyone who entered it. Hamish knew then that the person behind Morag's death was not content to let matters lie. They were watching, anticipating, manipulating. This was no longer a simple investigation of greed or old grudges. It was a game, and Hamish had just been made aware that the stakes were higher than he had imagined. He walked slowly through the croft, touching the table, the chair, the window-sill, reconstructing in his mind the sequence of movements that must have allowed someone to remove the bundle without leaving a trace. The door had been unbolted from outside, a simple adjustment, subtle enough to go unnoticed. Or perhaps the thief had duplicated the key. Hamish's thoughts shifted quickly. If the DLL was gone, so too might be any chance to tie the psychological clue to Callum definitively. He could still rely on observation, yes, but without physical confirmation. The case risked being dismissed once more. Hamish stepped outside into the frosty sunlight, scanning the small yard. The snow, though trampled by morning traffic, held no new footprints leading away. Whoever had taken the evidence had planned it meticulously, leaving no trail. Even the faint dread of the coal dust or the smudge of dye would have been removed. This was deliberate, a challenge. The real criminal was not only clever but bold. He knew he had to act fast. The village could be swayed by appearances, by authority declarations, by quick fixes. The stolen bundle was a test, a warning, a way to assert control over the pace of discovery. Hamish clenched his hands, determination hardening. He could not let the disappearance derail the investigation. Every detail, every subtle gesture, every shadow from the past, and every flicker of reaction still mattered. Even as he retraced his steps along the road toward the Frasers' cottages, Hamish felt the tension tighten. The real culprit was out there, moving with purpose, confident in their ability to manipulate what the authorities or even he could see. Trust, he realized, was fragile in Loch Derb now, easily fractured by fear and calculation. And somewhere, in that web of deceit and history, the truth awaited, hidden not just in evidence, but in the mind of a killer who had spent years perfecting patience and concealment. Hamish breathed deeply, letting the cold clear his thought. The disappearance of the bundle was not the end, it was a signal, and he knew he had to follow it, carefully, quietly, knowing that every misstep could give the real criminal another advantage. The shadows had shifted, and the game was far from over. Hamish barely had time to gather his thoughts before word reached him that the village was in uproar once more. Mrs. Fraser's cottage, just a few streets over from Morag's Croft, was in chaos. Her husband, Callum, had been found unconscious on the kitchen floor, a deep gash along his temple. The village constable, flustered and pale, met Hamish outside the house. "Someone's attacked him," the man said, voice shaking. He can't remember much. Didn't see the face, couldn't say who just woke up lying there. Hamish pushed past him into the cottage, noting the overturned chair. The small cabinet shifted askew, but otherwise little sign of struggle. Callum was slumped in a chair, eyes half-lidded, his hand pressed to his head. The minor injuries were shocking but not fatal, a warning rather than a death sentence. Yet Hamish could feel the message clearly. The real criminal was still at large, still orchestrating events, still watching, still daring. The authorities and Hamish himself to act. He knelt beside Callum, careful not to touch the gash directly, studying the man's reaction. "You were alone?" Hamish asked quietly. Callum blinked rapidly, trying to focus. "Aye, I think so. I don't remember. I went to bed, then I woke like this." Hamish's eyes swept the room, cataloguing every detail. The window was slightly ajar, but the frost on the sill suggested it had been untouched for hours. No footprints led away from the door. The kitchen knife, a possible weapon, had been left in a drawer, clean. Whoever had done this had struck and vanished, leaving only confusion. Stepping back, Hamish felt the tension in the air. This attack was precise, targeted and symbolic. The false confession, the stolen bundle, Callum's incapacitation, everything was calculated to mislead, to provoke fear, to maintain control. The pattern was no longer just about Morag's death. It was about establishing dominance over the investigation itself. Hamish's mind raced. If the villain was capable of entering a house without leaving evidence and incapacitating a man without witnesses, they were far ahead, perhaps anticipating each move he might take. He moved outside into the narrow lane, scanning the village rooftops, the frost-lined roads, the familiar streets that had become a labyrinth of unseen observers. The wind carried no voices, no hints, only the faint scent of peat and coal. The croft, the Fraser house, even the post office, they were all nodes in a pattern, small theatres where a story was being staged. Hamish realized that the criminal was not only clever but opportunistic, capable of striking again at a moment's notice. Returning to the Fraser cottage, he questioned the neighbours, listening for the tiniest discrepancies in their accounts. One woman swore she had seen a figure lurking near the croft earlier that morning, wrapped in a dark coat with the hood drawn low. Another mentioned hearing footsteps that didn't match any resident. Each detail was minor, almost forgettable, but Hamish noted it all, filing it mentally. The footprints outside, the smudge of dye, the stolen bundle, they were all pieces leading toward a more complex truth. Callum, now recovering slightly, fidgeted nervously. "Hamish, maybe they'll come for me again. Or someone else. I don't know who I can trust." Hamish's jaw tightened. The situation had escalated. This was no longer simply a matter of uncovering the perpetrator of Morag MacLeod's death. It was about preventing another act, predicting the villain's next move before the village paid the price. Whoever was behind it had patience, knowledge of the past, and a willingness to manipulate appearances, and they were testing him. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the village, Hamish stepped outside and looked toward the hills. The wind cut across the loch, cold and insistent. The villain had forced his hand, revealed that they were not finished. Every careful deduction, every psychological insight, every subtle clue he had gathered now took on new urgency. The web of past grievances, calculated deception, and orchestrated fear was alive, moving, and dangerous. Hamish felt the weight of it, the sharp pull of responsibility. He could no longer follow the crime at leisure. He had to anticipate it. He clenched his fists, determination settling like a stone in his chest. The villain was still several steps ahead. Yes, but Hamish Macbeth had never faced a puzzle he could not untangle. And now, more than ever, he would need all his cunning, patience, and keen observation to stop the next strike before it happened. The shadows were moving, and he would have to step into them deliberately, without hesitation, to catch the one who had already rewritten the rules of the game. Hamish returned to Morag's croft that evening, boots crunching on the thin crust of frost, the cold air sharp enough to clear his thoughts. The village had settled into an uneasy quiet, but he felt the tension like a taut wire, vibrating beneath the surface. Callum's attack, the vanished bundle, the false confession, they were all pieces, seemingly disconnected, yet something had begun to stir in his mind, a pattern waiting to be noticed. He moved slowly through the croft, letting his eyes rest on every familiar detail, the hearth, the table, the smudge of dye on the corner where he had tested Callum, the footprints in the frost outside the door. Nothing seemed new, yet everything now carried significance. He paused at the window, recalling an offhand comment from the postmistress about the package arriving at an unusual hour, and the ledger's faint note about Duncan Fraser. Each was trivial alone, easy to dismiss, but together they were starting to align. Hamish's gaze fell on the coal, still black and glossy from the first foot gift. He bent to inspect it, and noticed again the subtle way it had been handled, the same handling that had betrayed alum earlier. The pattern ones did just in who touched what, or when. It was in how each person interacted with the evidence, the small unconscious gestures that revealed more than words could. Calum's relief, his hesitation, even his over-eagerness had been part of a rhythm, a series of reactions that now fit into something larger. He thought back to Morag's ledger. The single note about Duncan Fraser and the unpaid debt. The ledger had seemed innocuous at first, a record of ordinary village interactions. Yet now it was clear the killer had relied on the village's memory of old grievances and the assumptions of time passing to cloak their own presence. Each move, each staged clue, each missed direction had been calculated to exploit the village's trust in routine and tradition. Walking carefully around the table, Hamish's attention caught on the linen bundle itself, or rather where it had been. He noticed a faint indentation in the dust on the floor, slightly angled, as if something had been lifted with a particular hand. The alignment matched the way Callum had handled it under the pretense of curiosity. Hamish's mind pieced together the motions, the placement, the removal, the interaction with others. It wasn't just about the objects themselves, it was about how people behaved around them. A flicker of memory surfaced. Eyelid Kerr's brief mention of the sharp smell. The night of Morag's death. At the time, it seemed insignificant, easily dismissed as ordinary burning or waste. You'd paired with the subtle handling of objects, the precise staging, the package arriving in Inverness. It was a thread that connected the two attacks, the first murder and the assault on Kellam. Hamish realized the villain had been creating a psychological trail, leaving only the smallest hints, testing reactions, and carefully observing which threads would be noticed. The pattern crystallized suddenly, in the quiet of the croft. It was in the confessions, the vials, or the stolen bundle. It was in the choreography of human behavior. Each suspect had reacted in a predictable way, betraying their knowledge, their fear, or their attempt at misdirection. The criminal had counted on distraction, on false assumptions, on the village celebrating a resolution that wasn't real. But Hamish had watched patiently, noting the subtleties. The key had been in plain sight all along, gestures, glances, the way hands brushed objects, the timing of each movement, each hesitation. He straightened and stepped to the door, scanning the yard and the frozen footprints beyond. The pieces fell into place in his mind like a puzzle he had long suspected existed, but had only now begun to see clearly. The crimes were not isolated acts, they were part of a deliberate sequence designed to mislead, intimidate, and obscure the truth. Whoever had orchestrated this had been several steps ahead from the very beginning, confident in their control over perception. Hamish breathed deeply, the cold air filling his lungs. For the first time since Morag's death, the chaos made sense. The false victories, the attacks, the stolen evidence, they were all part of a pattern, one that revealed the villain's methods and priorities. And now, for the first time, Hamish felt the certainty that had eluded him. If he could anticipate the pattern, understand the rhythm of the criminal manipulations, he could predict the next move and finally confront the person who had been shaping the events from the shadows all along. Hamish spent the night pacing along the frosted lanes of Lochtub, thinking over every gesture, every hesitant glance, every misstep that had seemed insignificant until now. The pieces had begun to align: the stolen bundle, the false confession, Callum, attack, the lingering traces of dye. But one element remained elusive: the why. Money, land disputes, old grudges. These explained some of it, but not the precision, not the theatrical staging, not the way the criminal had toyed with the village itself. There had to be something deeper. The next morning he returned to Morag's croft, this time with a notebook, his own, sketching maps of movements, footprints, and placement of objects. He traced the path of the bundle, the interaction of each suspect with the coal, the linen, the vials, connecting them with the ledger, the post office deliveries, and the timeline of events. Then, suddenly, it clicked. The true motive had nothing to do with wealth, nothing to do with the surface quarrels. It was personal, far more intimate than anyone in the village could have guessed. Hamish's mind went back 20 years, to the ledger entry about Duncan Fraser, the missing brother, and the cryptic note, debt unpaid. The ledger had seemed minor, trivial even, until he realized that the offender had not acted merely out of fear or revenge. The crime was a calculated attempt to settle a psychological debt, one that had lingered across generations, buried beneath family dynamics, pride, and shame. Morag had known something that threatened to unearth it. Callum, whether aware or not, had become a convenient target in a broader design. He imagined the villain at work, studying the village and the croft, aware of every superstition, every habit, every expectation. They had relied on the custom's first footing, the predictability of human behavior, and the assumptions of the authorities to stage their acts. The goal was not material gain, but control the desire to impose a narrative, to assert mastery over perception, to exact satisfaction for a past wrong no one else remembered or understood. The psychological picture became chillingly clear. The villainous mind had been shaped by obsession and long-held resentment, each slight, each forgotten insult, each unacknowledged injustice fueling a drive that transcended ordinary criminal motives. They were meticulous, patient, willing to manipulate entire communities to orchestrate the perfect crime. Morag's death. The false confession. The attack on Callum, all of it, had been carefully designed to assert dominance, to rewrite the history of old wrongs according to the villain's own terms. Hamish turned over the ledger again, tracing the faded ink, the careful handwriting. The offender had known Morag's routines, the habits of her neighbours, and even the likely reactions of the village to each event. It was an intricate psychological map, exploiting human behaviour at every turn. And the false confession, the stolen bundle, these were not just distractions. They were tests, calibrations, measures of control, each one revealing how far the perpetrator could push before the fragile trust of the village began to crack. For the first time, Hamish understood why Callum's attack had happened so precisely, yet without true intent to kill. It was symbolic, a demonstration of reach and influence, a warning to anyone who might interfere with the narrative the villain was imposing. The crime was a carefully choreographed display of psychological power, a message written in action rather than words, meant to terrify and confuse while remaining almost invisible to the casual observer. The pieces of the past and present merged, and the hidden motive revealed itself with clarity. The crime was about legacy, memory, and the satisfaction of settling a debt of pride, shame, and suppressed fury that had persisted unseen for decades. Hamish felt the weight of it, the realization that the villain's obsession was not transactional, no, opportunistic, but pathological, a need to control, to manipulate, to avenge in a way that would echo across generations. Standing by the hearth, looking at Morag's still face and the carefully arranged scene, Hamish knew that the true criminal was brilliant, patient, and dangerous. But he also understood that once the psychological motive had been exposed, the next moves could be predicted, the pattern anticipated. The villain's mind had left footprints in human behaviour, subtle and revealing, and Hamish Macbeth had begun to read them all. The hidden motive was no longer hidden, it was a key, and with it he finally held the means to bring the architect of death into the light. Hamish had spent the entire night walking the frost-bitten lanes of Lochdub, rehearsing every step, every gesture, every subtlety he had observed in Callum, in the cousin, in the shadow of the missing brother Duncan Fraser. He knew the villain would strike again if provoked, or if they sensed their control slipping, and now, with the hidden motive finally exposed, he had everything he needed to anticipate the next move. He returned to the croft at dawn, the first thin light brushing over the hills, and carefully arranged the scene. The hearth, the table, even the faint traces of dye were left as before, but Hamish added one subtle alteration. He left a small token of apparent negligence in the corner of the room, a rolled-up scrap of paper, carefully scented and placed where a careful observer would note C.E. It was bait, designed to test who would respond and how. By mid-morning, the village was still tense, watching as if waiting for the next act. Hamish positioned himself near the croft, hidden just enough that a casual passerby would not notice, yet able to see anyone approaching the house. He barely needed to wait. A shadow moved along the frozen path, a figure keeping to the edges, cautious, yet deliberate in their stride. His heart didn't race. He was patient, calm, knowing the pattern now. The figure slipped through the doorway with practiced ease, glancing around, brushing aside a chair that had been left slightly askew. Hamish noted each detail, the precise movement, the careful eye contact with objects, the subtle avoidance of frost-streaked footprints outside. This was no casual intruder. It was the person who had orchestrated every step, every deception, every fear in the village, looking for something. Hamish's voice came softly from the doorway, calm and deliberate. The figure froze mid-step, eyes widening ever so slightly. Hamish stepped forward, unhurried, letting the tension fill the room. The intruder's fingers twitched near their coat pocket, and for the first time, Hamish saw real panic. The careful composure faltering. "You've been very clever," Hamish continued, "and patient. But cleverness only goes so far when every habit, every small gesture, every subtle trace is noticed. The ledger, the coal, the linen, even the handling of objects, they all tell a story. And your story has led right here. The figure's shoulders stiffened. A hand went to the mouth, then hesitated, almost as if weighing words against action. Hamish remained still, unflinching, his gaze unwavering. You wanted control, he said quietly, to settle all debts, to manipulate perception, to exact satisfaction from grievances that lingered unseen for decades. But the pattern was never invisible. You underestimated observation, patience, and deduction. A trembling exhalation, a slight shift of weight, and then the figure lurched toward the door, eyes wild. Hamish was ready. He moved deliberately, closing the space between them in measured steps, forcing the intruder to hesitate. "Stop," he said firmly. "It ends here." The figure froze, and Hamish could see the realization dawning, the crumbling of carefully constructed pride and control. The dagger of desperation gleamed faintly in one hand, but the intruder's movements were no longer precise. Calculated, they were frantic, raw. Hamish, maintaining perfect composure, inched closer, every eye in the village now on the unfolding moment, though none spoke a word. Finally, the hand lowered, the dagger clattering to the floor. A single ragged breath, then a shaky voice. I had to. They would never have understood. It was mine to correct mine. The confession spilled out, chaotic, unfiltered, revealing the obsession, the compulsion, the decades of unresolved resentment that had driven the crimes from Morag's death, to the attack on Kellam, to the stolen evidence, to the false confession. Hamish listened, his gaze steady, absorbing every nuance, every tremor, every syllable. "It was not yours to correct," he said quietly, "and it ends here. No one else need suffer to settle your past. Justice does not bend to obsession." The intruder sank to the floor, shoulders shaking, the meticulously constructed mask of control finally stripped away. Hamish surveyed the room one last time, noting the placement of objects, the faint smudges of dye, the subtle clues that had guided him to this moment. Every gesture, every choice, every deviation had been anticipated, and yet patient and careful observation had prevailed. Outside, the village slowly exhaled. Hamish led the handcuffed culprit toward the constable, who had finally recovered from shock enough to take charge. The sun crested the hills, casting long shadows across Lochtub, illuminating a village that had been held in fear, now breathing again. Hamish Macbeth, calm and unshaken, knew the web of deception had been unravelled. The villain had been brilliant, patient, and dangerous, but even the most calculated plan could not escape a keen eye, a quiet mind, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Hamish watched as the constable led the handcuffed culprit down the lane, the ruder muttering fragmented confessions, haunted by decades of obsession and resentment. The village exhaled collectively, relief spilling into the streets like sunlight on frost. For a moment, it seemed the nightmare had ended. Morag's death avenged, Kellam safe, the stolen evidence recovered, the pattern unravelled. Hamish felt the familiar weight of closure begin to settle, the satisfaction of seeing a carefully orchestrated plan brought to light. Yet even as the village celebrated, a small nagging doubt tugged at him. Something remained unresolved, a subtle irregularity that his mind could not dismiss. The evidence had all pointed to the obsessed family member. The confessions had aligned with his psychological reading. Yet the disappearance of the linen bundle, the precise timing of the attack on Kellam, the way certain objects had been deliberately staged, some details still did not fit neatly. Hamish's instincts pricked with unease. The perfect trap had been sprung, yet the shadows still whispered of another hand. He returned to Morag's croft, retracing the final steps of the confrontation, examining every footprint, every smudge, every interaction once more. That was when he noticed it, a faint, almost imperceptible indentation in the dust near the hearth, slightly curved, as though someone had leaned there and shifted weight subtly. It did not match the posture of the handcuffed culprit, nor did it match the handling of the objects he had studied so carefully. Hamish crouched, head low, his keen eyes tracing the angle of the impression. A flicker of realization crossed his mind. The entire chain of events, the stolen bundle, the vials, the first foot, staging the attacks had been manipulated by more than one person. The obsessed family member had been the instrument, but someone else had been orchestrating the steps, guiding the reactions, nudging the plan toward the precise pattern Hamish had observed. The mastermind had remained invisible, content to let another take the fall while observing from the sidelines. He walked to the window, peering toward the nearby cottages. His mind raced through every conversation, every observation, every seemingly minor behavior over the past days. One detail he had dismissed avec cœur, as overly polite concern, her quiet insistence on remaining near the croft, the way she always seemed to appear at the edges of pivotal events snapped into focus. Her curiosity had seemed innocent, but now he recognized the subtle signs she had been monitoring, steering, and shaping events from behind the veil of helpfulness. Every misdirection, every planted clue, every stage reaction had been aligned with her presence. Hamish, his pulse quickened. The family member. His obsession had been genuine, a driving force, but it had been exploited. Someone with a cooler, calculating mind had used the chaos of past grievances and the predictable reactions of the village to hide their true hand. Eyelid's calm demeanor, her knowledge of village routines, even her understanding of human psychology had allowed her to manipulate not just the criminal but the investigators and villagers alike. He leaned back, letting the pieces fall into place. The first murder, the stolen evidence, the attack on Kellam, they had all been part of a larger design, one that ensured the true architect remained undetected. The handcuffed culprit had confessed willingly, or at least as willingly as obsession would allow, but Eyelid had remained in the shadows, invisible, patient, confident that no one would suspect her. Hamish, as eyes narrowed, the final twist was cruelly brilliant, the case far from closed. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Hamish turned slowly, every muscle alert. Outside stood Eyelid herself, calm, composed, smiling faintly as though she had expected him. "Hamish," she said softly, almost sweetly, "I see you've done a lot of work, but perhaps you've missed a detail or two." Her eyes glinted with the satisfaction of someone who knows more than anyone else in the room. Hamish's jaw tightened. He had been expecting a last move, a final test, but the speed and subtlety of it struck him anew. The mastermind was here, watching, daring him to connect the dots. He stepped back, hands loose, voice steady. "Indeed," he said quietly. "And now I think I see the whole picture. The puzzle is nearly complete, but your part in it will not go unseen." Eyelid, smile faltered just slightly, the briefest twitch that only Hamish could have noticed. The final confrontation had shifted from instrument to orchestrator, and now he would need all of his cunning to expose the hidden genius behind the chaos. The game was not over, it had simply entered its last, most dangerous phase, and Hamish Macbeth was ready to meet it head-on. Hamish's eyes never left Eyelid, as she stood in the doorway, calm, composed, almost serene, yet radiating the same controlled intensity that had orchestrated the chaos in Lochdub. He took a measured step forward, letting his observations settle. The faint dust smudges on the croft floor, the subtle displacement of the hearth coal, the alignment of footprints leading nowhere, all had pointed to someone quietly manipulating events from the shadows. And now, here she was, the missing piece of a puzzle no one else had recognized. "You've been careful," Hamish said, voice low and steady, more careful than anyone in the village could imagine. "Every stage gesture, every planted clue, every false lead, it all fits together when you understand your hand in it. The stolen bundle, the attack on Kellam, even the confession of the obsessed Fraser, each was a move on a board you controlled." Eyelid's lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I suppose you could say that," she replied. "I only guided the pieces into place. The village never suspected me, did they?" Her tone was light, almost conversational, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. Hamish moved closer, stepping a row. The table, pointing to the faint impressions in the dust where she had subtly leaned, where she had adjusted the objects to test reactions. "No," he said. "They didn't suspect, but these," he gestured to the faint traces, almost invisible to anyone else. "These told me everything. The slight pressure here, the angle of handling there, the timing of appearances, all tiny mistakes invisible to everyone else. But to someone patient and observant, they were the story." Eyelid's calmness flickered for the briefest instant, a sign of recognition. Hamish knew she understood that he had seen the invisible threads, traced them, and decoded them. Yet even now she did not falter entirely. Instead, she shifted, subtly assessing escape routes, testing his patience, gauging whether he could act fast enough to trap her. "Do you think you can stop me?" she asked, softly, almost teasing. Hamish shook his head calmly, with no hint of fear. "I don't need to stop you. You've already revealed yourself. The village, the patterns, the objects, the gestures, they all spoke. And now the truth is clear." Eyelid's eyes darted to the window, calculating. Hamish noticed the movement, the slight hesitation, the silent acknowledgement of risk she hadn't expected. For a heartbeat, he considered the possibility she might slip past him yet, vanish in the cold, shadowed streets of Lochdub. leaving him only with fragments of confirmation. But Hamish's patience had been earned over years of observing human nature. He did not panic. He stepped in closer, subtly blocking her path, and spoke with the calm authority that had unravelled. "Every deception so far, justice isn't always delivered by law alone," he said. "It's revealed by truth, by recognition, by understanding the story hidden in the smallest details. And that's what you've forgotten. The story is always visible to someone who sees everything." Eyelid's lips pressed together, her next move uncertain. She knew she had been exposed, her careful orchestration unravelling in the face of meticulous observation. And yet Hamish sensed the shadow of one last decision forming in her mind. Would she surrender, or would she vanish, leaving only the unsettling knowledge that even the most brilliant plan could slip beyond reach? Without warning, she stepped back, pushing against the doorframe. "Perhaps the story isn't finished," she said cryptically, and in a blur of motion she slipped past the edge of the croft, disappearing into the icy morning streets. Hamish lunged, but the village's narrow lanes and the dense frost slowed him just enough for her to vanish beyond sight. Hamish stood in the croft, breath steady, eyes scanning the door and the faint traces she had left behind. The invisible story had been revealed, her hand in the chaos. Her subtle manipulations, the psychological orchestration of the obsessed phrase, all of it, was now undeniable. The village could not have known, and even the authorities would have dismissed the invisible threads as coincidence. Yet Hamish had read them, connected them, and understood them. He exhaled slowly, the weight of unfinished business settling over him like frost on the hills. Justice, in the strict sense, had not been served. Eyelid had escaped, but the truth was laid bare. The hidden patterns, the subtle misdirections, the unspoken motives all now existed in the light of understanding. Hamish knew that wherever she went, the traces of her planning, her obsession, and her manipulation could be anticipated, and one day, perhaps, accounted for. For now, he returned to the croft, surveying the scene one last time. Morag's death had been avenged in part. Callum was safe, and the village breathed again, though unaware of how close they had come to being misled further. The invisible threads, the patterns, and the final revelation had proven, once more, that Hamish Macbeth was one step ahead. Yet the lingering shadow of the mastermind's escape left a shiver of uncertainty, a reminder that even in victory the game was never truly over. Hamish stepped out of Morag's croft inn, to the crisp morning air, the frost crunching beneath his boots. The village lay quiet, sun striking the peaks of the surrounding hills, painting the loch in gold and silver. The streets were empty, save for a few villagers venturing out after a restless night. And though the immediate danger had passed, a tension lingered in the air, a residual uncertainty that made even familiar paths feel strange. He paused at the edge of the croft yard, glancing back at the doorway where Eyelid had vanished. The faint scuff of her boots on the threshold, barely noticeable, was all the trace she had left behind. Hamish studied it carefully, noting how the arc of her step suggested a hurried departure, but not a panicked one. Her confidence remained intact. She had tested him, revealed herself, yet escaped with pause. The lingering thought that she might return, or worse, that she had already begun weaving another sequence of manipulations, settled heavily on him. Even as he walked down the frost-lined lane, his mind catalogued the subtle inconsistencies he had noted in recent days. A ledger entry that had once seemed trivial, the faint smudge of coal dust on a doorstep, an unusually timed delivery at the post office, all small clues that had now revealed themselves as part of the hidden narrative. And yet, even with the truth partially exposed, one final question gnawed at him, a piece of the puzzle that didn't fit neatly, a detail so slight that everyone else would have dismissed it, yet it hummed in his mind like a faint, unresolved chord. He stopped near the bridge over the loch, where the water ran dark and glassy beneath a thin layer of frost. In the reflection of the surface, he saw not just the sky, but the contours of the village as he had come to understand it, the rhythms, the habits, the subtle interactions that had guided him to this point. And he realized that, just as he had predicted the hidden motives and patterns, there could always be another layer, another unseen hand at work. Criminals who think they are clever rarely understand the limits of patience, but sometimes a second layer of cunning waits quietly in the shadows. A faint, almost imperceptible piece of paper fluttered past his boots, carried by the morning wind. He bent and picked it up, a scrap, torn unevenly, with a single word scrawled in careful, deliberate handwriting, "Watch." There was no signature, no indication of who had left it. Hamish, as lips curved into a small, knowing smile. It could be Eyelid. It could be someone else entirely, a new player entirely, or even a warning planted before she had vanished. Whatever the source, the message was clear. The story was not over. The threads of observation, the patterns he had studied, the invisible choreography of human behavior they would continue, and someone, somewhere, was already planning the next move. Hamish folded the scrap carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. He continued along the lane, boots crunching against frost, letting his mind dwell on the subtleties. A glance exchanged between neighbours, the angle of a window shutter, a shadow that seemed too deliberate in its placement. Every detail that had once been overlooked now carried weight, a reminder that in Lochdub nothing was ever entirely random. The village itself, quiet and picturesque, held secrets waiting to be uncovered, mysteries that would surface only for the patient, the observant, and the persistent. By the time he reached the outskirts, the sun was higher, warming the frozen ground and turning the loch to shimmering silver. Hamish paused, looking back at the village, letting the distant chimneys and winding streets settle into the familiar shapes. He had unravelled a complex web, exposed obsession and manipulation, and seen the invisible threads that guided human behaviour. Yet he knew, as he always did, that one layer revealed only the next layer. One solved mystery merely hinted at the ones that remained hidden, waiting for another observer to notice the faintest clue. With a final glance at the village and a slow exhale that carried away the tension of the past days, Hamish set off along the hillside path, boots crunching in rhythm with his thoughts. The loch sparkled beside him. The wind whispered over the hills, and somewhere in the village, or perhaps far beyond it, another story waited to unfold. The case had closed for now, but the patterns endured, and the shadows still moved. Hamish Macbeth, ever watchful, walked on, knowing that in Lochdub a mystery never truly ends.